Welcome everybody to another episode of Ask the Expert. I'm Amy Board. I am your host. And how are we all doing? How are we all doing in our homes, our social distancing? Our guest today is Dr. Len Valentino, the new CEO at the National Hemophilia Foundation. And he actually prefers the term physical distancing rather than social distancing, which I am going to adopt. We don't have to social distance. There's so many platforms that we can socially connect. So how are you guys doing with that? How much are you on your phones right now? I just want you to know that my screen time has gone up, I don't know, something like 27%. It's bad. It's so bad. I downloaded several games onto my phone. I have never been a game person, but I did it, so I won't be on Instagram. This is 100% way too personal for you guys, but I just want you to know that we're all in the same boat. So to you and your games, whatever you're doing to stay sane, I'm into it. Today we have a great episode, I'm not gonna lie. It's really insightful. How interesting in our community. Last month, of course, our episode was with the new CEO at HFA, Sharon Myers, and this month we have Dr. Valentino, who is the newly appointed CEO at NHF. How interesting that we have two leaders at our national organizations in the midst of this unprecedented time of a global pandemic. My goodness, these poor people who have been thrown into the deep end. But I'm very excited about our conversation with Dr. Valentino. It's going to be a good one. Before we get into it, I haven't heard from you guys very often. You don't email me your thoughts. I would love to hear if you have a local physician at your HTC that you think is a rock star, if you have a local nurse, somebody who has cared for your family, who has enlightened you to your treatment, I would love to hear their names. I would love to hear your thoughts about them and why maybe they should be a guest on Ask the Expert. If you would email me, that would be delightful. Email me at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com and let me know why I should interview your hometown expert. I think that would be great, and it would help me expand some of my view of who I should be talking to in this community. So I would love that. You can always find me at Twitter. My handle is @Bordeaux87, so you can tweet me as well. But let's jump into it. Dr. Len Valentino, he is legitimately cool. I'm not going to lie. I was a little intimidated. You're going to hear me be a little intimidated at the beginning, which is so dumb, and then I loosen up later on. He has been a working physician for years and made a transition into the biotech industry, and his reasons for doing that are in the next episode on Thursday, and they're legit. It's a great section where he talks about why he went into biotech, and now he's leading a national nonprofit organization. What a cool career. Fascinating that NHF selected a physician to be in that role, and I'm very excited about it. I think you guys are seeing some of the output of that already. If you haven't been involved in NHF's recent webinar series, they do a webinar every Friday with Dr. Valentino. It started about the COVID crisis, but it's kind of moved into bigger things. They talk about mental health. They're talking about women's issues. It's wonderful. Those webinars are archived on NHF's website, hemophilia.org. So you can check those conversations, and they are generated by community questions. The response that they have received, I think, has blown their minds, and I have just been so impressed with that output. So it's lovely to have access to not only a leader at the top of one of our national organizations, but also a physician. So that is a tremendous resource. But we get to hear a little bit more of his thoughts on the paradigm shift in treatment in the hemophilia space, how NHF is making a shift into more of a research agenda. He talks a little bit about that and what that's going to mean for the community. He also speaks and touches on the local chapter network, our regional chapters that are the lifeblood of our community. I know many of you listeners are very involved in your local chapters, and he talks about the future of the local chapter network as well. It's great. You're in for a treat. So grab yourself a cup of coffee and let's have ourselves a conversation. I'm your host, Amy Board, and welcome to episode 39, or our Dr. Valentino episode of the Ask the Expert podcast. Hey, listeners of Ask the Expert, I have something that you might enjoy. The Pain Podcast, a new bloodstream media podcast made possible by Tremo Pharmaceuticals. Pain affects us all, and for those of us living with chronic conditions, pain can have an even more prominent role. That's why I am so proud to share with you the Pain Podcast. dedicated to exploring pain from every angle. The Pain Podcast provides expert knowledge, innovative strategies, and first-hand stories from people on the front lines of the pain epidemic. Psychodynamic therapy, opioids, cannabis, chiropractic surgery, systematic racism, Western medicine, the healthcare system, and gender bias are just some of the topics explored in the first season of this documentary-style audio experience. The Pain Podcast is produced by Bloodstream Media and sponsored by Tremo Pharmaceuticals. Tremo is currently investigating 2 COX-2 selective NSAIDs. NSAID, for those of you who aren't familiar, stands for non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. While neither of these treatments are FDA approved, they are in clinical trials, and you can learn more about those trials, Tremo's mission, and the dedicated team leading it by going to tremorx.com. That's TREMEAURX.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the Pain Podcast from bloodstreammedia.com. Dr. Valentino, welcome to the podcast today. We are so thrilled to have you. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Amy. I'm really excited to be here today.
You have been a figurehead in the hematology space for decades, but I imagine that some of our listeners are unfamiliar with your roots in the bleeding disorder community space specifically. Would you mind sharing a bit about your background and your trajectory towards your position at NHF today?
Sure. I'll take you back probably all the way to undergraduate and medical school. I attended both at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. There I had a mentor, Dr. Henry Lynch, who was a clinical geneticist who taught me quite a bit and really started to fascinate me with genetics. I then did my internship and residency, followed by a chief residency at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And there, again, I had a wonderful mentor, Dr. George Honig, who was a pediatric hematologist, oncologist, who I learned a great deal from. And then I did my fellowship at UCLA in Los Angeles. And there I had the privilege of working alongside Dr. Louis Diamond, who is the father of pediatric hematology, along with Dr. Steve Feig, who both taught me a great deal. I can keep on going. I then entered practice in 1990 at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, where I was until 2013. And there I was influenced by many people, including Bruce Evett, but most importantly by my patients and their stories. I think those were really the important influences that I had. It was there that I created the Rush Hemophilia and Thrombophilia Center. We were doing patient care, lab research, clinical research, and then providing education, and it was really very rewarding. I also had the opportunity to participate with the Illinois chapter of the Hemophilia Foundation, which was, at that time was called the Hemophilia Foundation of Illinois, now Bleeding Disorders Alliance Illinois. I was the medical director for 3 years, and that was really fun. But my focus and my passion has really always been on joint bleeding and why patients that bleed in their joint develop joint disease.
What has your transition been like to NHF? What was attractive to you about the position at NHF, and what has it been like?
It's been pretty exciting. Obviously, it's been an interesting time to start this role. But NHF has had a very long tradition of advocating and educating the hemophilia community and now the inherited bleeding disorders community, as the mission more recently was expanded to include all inherited bleeding disorders. I think we're in a really interesting time of unprecedented growth with emergence of new treatments and paradigms for treatment, especially around subcutaneous non-factor treatments. And soon gene therapy will move from the laboratory to the clinic. And the choices that patients have are ever more complex. And I see a real need for strong education of both consumers of healthcare, but also those who deliver the healthcare with these new treatments, as well as education to those who will pay for these treatments. And I think NHF is in a great place to be able to do all of this.
That beautifully lends into my next question. I wanted to ask your opinion. What role does NHF play in the community nowadays? It's a very broad question, but we have so many organizations here in the bleeding disorder space. And specifically, what do you think the role of NHF is in our community?
Yeah, I think NHF has a very important role in the inherited bleeding disorders community today. And I think it will continue to play a key role in the future as well, especially as new treatments enter the treatment area and reduce the morbidity and mortality due to bleeding. It's imperative to ensure that all patients have access to these innovative medicines And furthermore, I think as a community, we need to promote and advocate for innovation in care for bleeding disorders, including platelet disorders, for which either no treatment exists or, some of those diseases where the burden of treatment is significant. So I see the role of NHF to advocate for access to treatments and a cure that can be delivered by the comprehensive treatment center network that we've become so accustomed to as a model for our care and really as a model for other disease states as well.
It's been apparent, at least to me personally, here on the outside, and being very aware of the direction that NHF wants to go, that the board of directors really wants to head more towards a research-based initiative and goals for the organization. Can you share a little bit more about that, if that's even true, if my perception is true, and how will the community benefit from going in that direction in terms of research?
So, Amy, that's a really insightful question. I believe that an investment in research today will pay dividends tomorrow. The future of the sons and daughters with inherited bleeding disorders will be improved by continued innovation in care delivery and treatments that'll prevent the complications of yesterday. The big question exists today in areas such as, how to manage and better prevent age-related comorbidities in people with bleeding disorders. Mental health is a big problem for everyone, and bleeding disorder population is no different. But their bleeding disorder may exacerbate these issues. So we really need to have a better understanding of how to manage and hopefully prevent mental health issues in the community. Joint disease, as I said, has always been an area that I've been intensely interested in, as well as inhibitor development. These are a big part of my work in the past and will continue to be issues that we face today and into the future. Another area I'm concerned about is health disparities. And this has really been brought out with COVID-19, where these health disparities are ever more important. And I think that being able to have research into how we overcome these issues, including these disparities in health delivery, and in ensuring that our research is focused on, these patient-important questions that will then lead to better care, better treatment, and eventually better outcomes for the community.
Before we head into that, topical arena with COVID and the BDC going viral, virtual rather, which I'm excited to get into, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this treatment shift that we have in the hemophilia space. What has it been like for you to be so close to the developments of new treatments like gene therapy and non-factor replacement? What has that been like?
Yeah, so before I answer your question, I do hope the BDC goes viral, by the way.
Good call.
The evolution in the treatment paradigm has been really epic. When I started collaborating with patients on their healthcare needs, we were fighting the battle to get access to regular preventative injections of factor 8 or factor 9 to really provide prophylaxis against bleeding. I think the landmark joint outcome study moved the field forward quite a bit for children, and then studies of the benefit of prophylaxis in adults emerged. And these brought on new challenges for the community. The development of EHL products provided, an added option and lessened some of the burden that prophylaxis brought. But the development of a sub-Q alternative truly addressed that burden that patients have with the disease treatment. And I think this has been really impactful for the community and for patients and families. I think additionally, the lower likelihood of inhibitor development with these products also has had a significant benefit for the community. Obviously, there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm around gene therapy, but I think this brings an entire new set of questions and concerns for patients and the loved ones of those patients to grapple with regarding safety of gene therapy, its effectiveness, the predictability of the products, as well as their durability. So I think there's a lot of areas that we still need more information around our non-factor therapies as well as gene therapies. But I'm really excited about the innovation that's coming and how we as a community can bring these innovations to patients in a safe and effective way.
So in your opinion, what role will NHF play in this paradigm shift in treatment that's already started, but I know will continue to gain steam for years to come here? What role will the organization play?
NHF's core mission is focused on advocacy, education, and research. Advocacy for access to innovation, as well as well-established treatments, allowing patients a choice in their treatment is going to be ever more important. Access to healthcare delivered using the model that has been developed and patients have become so accustomed to and as I said before, is really a standard for chronic disease management in other disease states as well. So I think that advocating for care and treatments is going to be important, but also education of all stakeholders, consumers of healthcare, professionals, policymakers, payers, providers of healthcare, as well as health systems, is really going to be vital to ensure that we maintain and continue to evolve healthcare in a responsible way to meet the needs of our community. NHF, I think, really needs to remain nimble to be able to adapt to the new challenges that emerge. For example, COVID-19, I think, is a great example of that and how COVID-19 has impacted the bleeding disorders community. In the end, education and advocacy are important, but I really think that we need to learn how to leverage our research to properly use all the medications and to continue to innovate our treatments and our delivery of care for the betterment of the population.
I'm going to ask you a question that I didn't give you in our pre-interview set of questions. I thought about it later today. One of the greatest achievements, in my humble opinion, in the past decade of NHF is the growth of the regional chapters. And I was an executive director of the Colorado chapter for years, and so I saw this firsthand. NHF really championed staff growth and board development and have really, truly have been a part of making that regional network more stable and sustainable. And how do you see the chapter network growing during your tenure here at the top at NHF?
And I think the chapters are incredibly important to the long-term viability of the community and the network of care that we've developed. The chapters serve a really important place to be able to gain insight about what are the patient-important questions, but more importantly, to deliver the services that the community needs so desperately. So I see chapters as a really vital component of the advocacy, education, as well as research. Without a strong chapter network, I think the community will suffer.
I agree, Dr. Valentino. Let's talk about COVID-19. What an interesting time for you to step into this role. What was it like for NHF and your team surrounding you, the board of directors? What was it like during the onset of the pandemic? What conversations did you all have? What concerns did you have for the community? What was it like behind the scenes?
The concerns that NHF had were for the safety and welfare of our staff, employees, volunteers, and all those who serve in our community and are part of our community. Above all, we needed to have a clear focus on safety. One example of that is we promptly closed our New York office and issued a work from home guideline. We suspended all travel and moved to virtual interactions. We didn't know if the virus would disproportionately affect the bleeding disorders community, but I think that's something that we needed to be aware of and really protect the community to the best of our ability. So working, closely with the Medical and Scientific Advisory Council of NHF, along with other experts, we devised a plan for our internal staff, but also we're able to provide some recommendations to chapters as well as to patients on our Friday community webinars.
So I wanted to bring up the webinars. They are every Friday. They are a different topic every Friday. They're led by you. They're generated by community questions. I have been so impressed with the outcome, and I just wanted to hear your impressions of what the community has been concerned with. What have you gathered that they are concerned with during this time?
I think the evidence that the community webinars have been successful is by the numbers of people who participated. And I think that there was a need for this type of information to be delivered into the community and to be responsive, but more importantly, to give the community a sense that they were being listened to. So we've addressed topics that were brought to the forefront by questions on our community webinar. So for example, we've talked about mental health. We talked about staying active and physiotherapy during this time. We had a really nice program on telemedicine. We talked about maintaining treatment recommendations, as well as providing general information on the virus and COVID-19 on a regular basis. The community's been concerned with the availability of products and supplies, which prompted a statement from MASAC on home supply. There have also been a number of questions around Hemlibra, given, the reports of thrombosis in patients with COVID-19. This has been both blood clots as well as stroke. So I think there's been a lot of issues around that. Last week, we had Dr. Ragney and Dr. Quidis that were talking specifically, trying to do question and answer. And a lot of that focused on the thrombotic issues. So we've used those webinars as trying to be really responsive to the questions that the community is asking us.
Have the webinars shifted your thoughts at all about what programming you're going to create here in this time? Has your team started to think about that in terms of maybe what you assumed the needs were and then what they actually are with all of this community engagement? What has the consensus been or the conversations been in terms of educational programming staff?
I've been in this community for more than 30 years. I firmly believe, and I've witnessed firsthand, that this community has always been very thoughtful and eager to learn. It's a community that is eager to get new information. And I think that, whether it's related to sort of this acute issue of COVID-19 or it's related to the best way that they can preserve their joints, I believe that the community is open and receptive. So they, of course, want information about what's at hand today, which is COVID-19. But I think the perspective of the community that I've been really impressed with is that they still want to learn and get more information about treatment options, their decision-making process, what are the risks and benefits of each of these treatments, and how are they as individuals and as families going to process all the information that's coming towards them. And I think this is a role that NHF can continue to play.
Will the current COVID crisis slow down any efforts of gene therapy development, in your opinion?
So I think that all research efforts not directly related to COVID-19 are likely to be impacted by the pandemic. Federal as well as philanthropic resources are being diverted to understand this virus and to find treatments and hopefully a vaccine. So I think the gene therapy developers need to understand the implications of their product in the context of COVID-19. For example, most of the gene therapy programs are using steroids or some form of immunosuppression. There's an ongoing need for monitoring, close monitoring of these patients inherent in our clinical trials. And in early commercialization, there's going to be a continued need for this monitoring and regular contact. So how we manage that within the context of a pandemic and sort of the shelter in place restrictions, is really going to be challenging. For the patient population to really move forward, I think we have to do that, with research that's conducted in a careful and thoughtful way. I think that hemophilia is a little bit different than maybe some other areas where the standard of care for our population is excellent. It may be burdensome, but really the outcomes have been very good. I think the situation for hemophilia is really different than, for example, if you look at spinal muscular atrophy or muscular dystrophy, where the standard of care is clearly not very good. Those trials probably will be, a little bit different prioritization than for hemophilia, where the standard of care is already quite good. And I think patients as well as the clinicians and researchers need to, balance the risks versus benefits, as we always do for the community. And obviously the research will be ever more important moving forward, but I think we have to do this in a very thoughtful and respectful way to preserve the safety and well-being of our patients.
Dr. Valentino, I'm going to go rogue again with a question I just thought of. Describe the importance of having standards of care, and what will NHF's role be in determining standards of care for joint health or new treatments and that type of thing?
Standards of care are incredibly important. These guidelines and standards are really created hopefully through evidence-based information that's generated in the course of research. And it's through that type of evidence where we have the best guidelines, and those result in standards of care. The other is, and what most of our standards of care are based on, are expert opinion and guidelines from consensus. These are not optimal, but in many cases it's all that we have because we lack real-world evidence that drives the development of guidelines and standards of care. I think the role for NHF in this is advocating for guidelines and then also having the voice of the patient expressed. These guidelines need to be developed by the clinicians and experts in the field. I don't believe that it's the role of NHF to develop the guidelines. We can certainly support their development and work with other groups that are expert in this area. And then I think our role is really to have the voice of the patient expressed. So, for example, a good area for this is, what's really important to the patient? When you have a standard of care that standard of care should be addressing something that's important to the patient. And I think that's the role that NHF plays in the development of guidelines and standards of care, is really ensuring that the patient voice is represented in those.
I think that is so important and something that we don't talk about at a community level all the time. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Of course, the BDC, the Bleeding Disorder Conference, the annual meeting that NHF puts on every year, just made the announcement that you guys are going to go virtual and hopefully viral. That must be a huge undertaking. Tell me about the decision to go virtual. What does that mean? When will we get more information? That just must have been a huge thing for you and your staff.
The decision was pretty easy to make. The challenge was arriving at a point where we could make that decision. The health and well-being of the community was the first and really only priority, and was really at the center of the decision. Gaining the clarity around the situation in the country took time. And I think that's where, the challenge is really getting to that point of clarity. We wanted to make a decision that would ensure that we could reach the most patients, the most family members, the largest segment of the community, with a goal of providing really high quality education to the attendees. So if we weren't going to be able to ensure that we could do that, we weren't going to proceed forward. I think we've got a good plan in place, but I'm going to allow your listeners to make that call in August, whether we delivered on our goal and we met to the challenge of really delivering something that's of quality for the community. It's the first time we're doing it. There's going to be challenges, but we really want to make sure that we're delivering something that's of use to the community and is really providing value to them. The end decision was really easy because it's the health and well-being of the community that's most important.
Are registrations open? Can you register for the conference?
You can register for the conference at this point. I believe that the online registration is still open, and we're in the process of converting the live registration now to virtual.
Cool. Listeners, I will do that research and put it in the program notes for you all of where you guys can register. Dr. Valentino, what is your vision for NHF moving forward as you're taking this new role? Where do you see the organization in 3 to 5 years?
So my vision for the organization is really to speak with one voice for the inherited bleeding disorders community. It's really around bringing folks together to advance the quality of care for everyone with an inherited bleeding disorder. The challenge is how to do that, and we're working with multi-stakeholder groups to come to an understanding of, how we can best advocate for, educate, and then conduct research for this community to increase the care that everybody will receive, and that we basically improve the quality of life for all of our patients, their families, and everybody that's touched by an inherited bleeding disorder.
In your opinion, what do you think the greatest barrier will be to accomplishing that vision?
I think, in order to reach a place where we speak with one voice for the inherited bleeding disorders community, we all need to put the patients first and their families first. They need to be at the center. And if we keep our collective eye on the ball, and that's really, the patient's well-being and their family's well-being, then what each of us does individually and collectively as organizations will really reach that goal. We have to put our own individual agendas aside and work together to advocate, educate, and then conduct research so that we really can move the community forward. There's so many important issues that this community faces. And together, I think we're stronger if we have one voice, and that voice can be much louder when we're all aligned together. We talked a bit about research, and I think, again, through research and developing a national research agenda, then executing against this agenda will really make our community move forward. It'll improve, each patient's journey on their way to a cure, leaving no bleeding disorder behind. I think that's a really important concept to get behind. The National Hemophilia Foundation is for all inherited bleeding disorders. So I think we really need to think about that. And, no matter how small the population may be, we really need to begin to focus on all bleeding disorders, not just ones where it's popular right now to focus on, hemophilia A and hemophilia B. Von Willebrand disease is critically important. I talked a little bit about platelet disorders, the rare bleeding disorders. I think all of those are incredibly important as we move forward. And we need to keep the patient's journey in mind for each of these disorders on the way to a cure.
Do you think a cure is possible in our lifetime? Is that a brutal question to end this podcast on?
Depends on how long you plan to live. The promise of a cure has been in this community for a long time. There's many different ways to define cure, and I'm certainly not the person who can define a cure. I think that really is somebody who's living with the bleeding disorder as to how they want to define a cure. The gene therapy will ameliorate an individual's symptoms. Is that a cure? That's not for me to decide. I think that's for the patients and the patient community to decide. But again, I think developing, a national research agenda is something that we need to make those steps forward. It's really about the patient's journey. And we need to be improving all steps on that journey, not just focusing, on the cure, but really ensuring that we can improve the life of, each patient as an individual and as a family and a community along their journey towards a cure. And I think it'll be most impactful when we can realize that for multiple segments of our population. Like I said, not only for hemophilia A and B, but really for other bleeding disorders, especially those rare disorders where they don't get a lot of attention just because there's, just a few hundred patients in the community that are affected. We really need to pay attention to all of our bleeding disorders and move our agenda forward. So will there be a cure in our lifetime? I hope I live long enough to see that, at least for hemophilia A or B. But my real goal is to see cures for multiple bleeding disorders, von Willebrand disease and rare bleeding disorders and some of the platelet disorders. That would be a real achievement.
Oh, I loved that answer. Thank you so much. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
No, it's okay.
Dr. Valentino, thank you for joining us. What an engaging and insightful conversation. I so appreciate it. Listeners, please check out hemophilia.org for information on NHF's Friday webinar series and to find out more information about the BDC registration. That is the Bleeding Disorder Conference that's going to be virtual. Registration is open, so make sure to check out hemophilia.org. And tune in this Thursday for an extended interview with Dr. Valentino. We're going to talk all about COVID-19 advice and if he misses patient's care, and also his thoughts on the documentary series, The Last Dance. Very important conversation. So stick around, and I'll see you on Thursday, everybody.